What if the greatest love story of your life has absolutely nothing to do with anyone else? What if it's the story of a woman who loved so deeply, so completely, so extraordinarily, that she disappeared inside that love, piece by quiet piece, night after silent night, until one morning she stood in front of her mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back? What if this woman is someone you know? What if this woman is sitting somewhere right now, smiling her carefully calibrated smile, wearing colors that aren't truly hers, laughing with a delay, sleeping at the edge of her own bed, dreaming about dancing in kitchens and waking up too afraid to move? What if I told you that this story doesn't end in tragedy, that it ends in the most breathtaking, most courageous, most devastatingly beautiful act of romance you have ever witnessed? Because she comes back. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in red sweaters and loud laughter and grocery receipt poetry and 2-hour phone calls about nothing. She comes back to herself, and it is the greatest love story ever written. Stay until the end, because the ending will change the way you love yourself forever. She used to dance in the kitchen. Not gracefully, not in the way that looks beautiful from doorways and finds its way into photographs. She danced the way thunderstorms move, with complete disregard for what anything looked like, hips rolling to music only she could hear inside her chest, spatula raised like a conductor's wand, flour dusting her cheeks like winter snow had decided to fall specifically for her. She used to laugh until her stomach hurt. She used to write poetry on grocery receipts when inspiration struck between the milk and the oranges. She used to call her mother every Sunday and talk for 2 hours about absolutely nothing and everything simultaneously. She used to wear perfume on ordinary Tuesdays, simply because she liked the way it made the air around her feel alive. She used to be so remarkably, effortlessly, completely herself. And then, slowly, the way seasons change without announcing their departures, she stopped. It began with something so small she almost laughed about it later, when she finally had the courage to trace the timeline of her own disappearance. It began on a rainy October evening when she was dancing in the kitchen, and she saw the expression on the face watching her from the living room doorway. Not cruel, not deliberately unkind, just vaguely uncomfortable, slightly embarrassed, carrying that particular brand of quiet judgment that doesn't need words to wound. She stopped dancing. She told herself it was because dinner was ready. She told herself this so convincingly that she almost believed it, and that belief, that first tiny, comfortable lie she told herself, became the cornerstone upon which an entire architecture of self-abandonment was carefully, lovingly, romantically constructed. By November, she had stopped dancing altogether. Not dramatically, not with any grand announcement or tearful ceremony. She simply found herself standing still in kitchens where music played, her body remembering the desire to move, but her mind already calculating how that movement would be received, already editing herself before she even began. This is how it always starts, not with force, but with foresight. Not with prohibition, but with anticipation. She became so extraordinarily skilled at predicting which version of herself would be most comfortably received that she began pre-erasing the versions that wouldn't make the cut. The dancing woman, erased. The woman who laughed too loudly at her own jokes before she'd even finished telling them, silenced. The woman who cried at commercials featuring elderly people and dogs, embarrassed into composure. The woman who talked about her dreams with the breathless urgency of someone who genuinely believed they would come true, quieted, gradually, then completely. December arrived cold and bright, and she stopped writing poetry on grocery receipts because she'd once pulled one from her pocket, and the look she'd received had been so perfectly, precisely dismissive that something inside her had folded up like origami, neat, deliberate, irreversible. She began buying proper notebooks instead. Then she stopped filling those. Then she stopped carrying them. By January, she had forgotten that she'd ever written poetry at all, which is perhaps the most devastating kind of forgetting. Not the loss of memory, but the loss of the understanding that something was ever worth remembering. The Sunday phone calls with her mother shortened. First to 90 minutes, then to an hour, then to 45 apologetic minutes filled with glances at the clock and lowered voices and the particular kind of distraction that mothers always notice, but rarely name, because naming it requires acknowledging something too painful to say out loud. Her mother noticed. Her mother noticed everything. Noticed the way her daughter's laughter had developed an almost imperceptible delay, as though it now had to pass through some internal approval process before it was permitted to emerge. Noticed the way she said "we" for everything now, even for preferences that were clearly, historically, entirely her own. Noticed the way she'd stopped wearing red. "You used to love red," her mother said once, carefully, during one of those shortened Sunday calls. "I still do," she replied, glancing down at the beige sweater she was wearing. The beige she'd been wearing for 3 months without quite noticing how thoroughly beige had colonized her wardrobe the way fog colonizes a harbor. Quietly, completely, until you can no longer see the ships. Spring came, and she stopped wearing perfume on ordinary Tuesdays. This felt like the smallest loss, which is exactly why it was one of the largest. Because perfume on ordinary Tuesdays had never been for anyone else. It had been purely, entirely, magnificently for herself. That private luxury of making the air around her body smell like something worth inhabiting. It had been an act of self-love so instinctive, she'd never even thought to call it that. When she stopped, she told herself it was because the bottle was running low. She never bought another one. She began sleeping differently. Not poorly, she slept fine, deeply even, exhausted by the daily labor of curating herself into acceptable shapes. But she slept in a posture of apology, curled toward the edge of her own bed as though even in unconsciousness, she was trying to take up less space, disturb less air, exist more quietly than her actual body required. She dreamed of dancing sometimes. In the dreams, she was always in a kitchen. Not any kitchen she'd actually lived in, but some composite kitchen, assembled from every version of home she'd ever imagined. And in this dream kitchen, she was always alone, always dancing, always breathtakingly free in the way that only sleeping selves and forgotten selves can be. The music in these dreams was always just slightly beyond identifying. Not quite classical, not quite something she'd ever actually heard, but something that felt like being young and completely unobserved and entirely allowed. She always woke from these dreams feeling like she'd lost something she couldn't name. By summer, her friends had begun noticing too. Layla, who had known her since they were 17 and terrible and gloriously themselves, said it most directly one evening over wine and pasta and the specific intimacy of women who have been friends long enough to speak the uncomfortable truths. "Where did you go?" Layla asked, not unkindly, looking at her friend across the candlelit table with the expression of someone watching a beloved book slowly lose its pages. "I'm right here," she said, smiling the smile she'd been perfecting, warm, reassuring, not too wide, not too loud, perfectly calibrated. "No," Layla said quietly. "You're not." She opened her mouth to argue, to perform reassurance, to display the smile again, and then something shifted. Something cracked along a fault line she hadn't known was there. Not dramatically, not with tears or declarations, just a small, seismic, private shift somewhere behind her sternum, like a door that had been sealed for months opening just one fraction of an inch. She said nothing. She looked down at her wine, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the exact shape and weight of everything that was missing. She drove home that night along a route she didn't usually take, not intentionally, not with any grand plan, simply because her hands seemed to have decided before her mind caught up. She ended up on a road that ran alongside the river, the water catching the last light of summer evening and turning it into something luminous and fleeting and heartbreakingly beautiful. She pulled over, She sat in the parked car beside the river and she simply breathed. And in that breathing, in that specific quality of stillness, she began the terrifying, necessary, profoundly romantic work of taking inventory. When had she last danced? 8 months ago, maybe 9. When had she last laughed without editing the sound? She genuinely could not remember. When had she last worn something red, written something true, said something that surprised even herself with its honesty and fire? The list of absences grew longer than the summer evening could contain. She sat beside that river for a very long time. The darkness came in gradually, gently, the way all important transformations come, not announcing themselves, just accumulating until the world looks entirely different from how it looked at the beginning. Stars appeared, tentative at first, then bold, then magnificent in their absolute refusal to dim themselves for anyone's comfort. She watched them and thought about Red. She thought about dancing and grocery receipts and poetry that arrives between the milk and the oranges. She thought about Sunday phone calls and perfume on ordinary Tuesdays. She thought about the dream kitchen and the music she could never quite identify and the freedom she felt there, that complete, devastating, luminous freedom of being entirely, unapologetically herself. And she thought about the woman in the morning mirror, the one she'd been walking past for months without really looking, the one she'd been managing and editing and minimizing, the one who had been standing there all along inside the glass, waiting with extraordinary patience to be properly seen. She went home, and she stood in her bathroom and she looked at herself, really looked, the way you look at something precious you've been keeping in a drawer, the way you look at a letter you've been afraid to open. She looked until she could see past the performed composure, past the carefully maintained surface, past the woman who had become so skilled at occupying other people's comfort zones that she'd forgotten the coordinates of her own. Somewhere behind all of that, barely visible but absolutely still present, was the woman who had danced in kitchens. She was still there, quieter than before, thinner at the edges, somewhat transparently constructed, but there. Impossibly, magnificently, stubbornly there. She didn't go looking for perfume at midnight. She didn't call Layla to announce any realizations. She didn't make any declarations or decisions or dramatic gestures toward her own reclamation. She simply stood at her closet, breathing, remembering, allowing, and moved 3 beige sweaters aside to reach for something she found hanging at the very back, where she'd put it months ago, telling herself the color was too much, too bold, too startlingly, unapologetically alive. Red. She pulled it out. She held it in both hands like something recovered from wreckage, like something she'd thought was lost to the sea. She didn't put it on that night. She simply held it, carried it to the bed, lay down with it folded across her chest like an answered prayer, like a promise she was making to the woman in the mirror, to the woman in the dream kitchen, to every version of herself she'd been sending into quiet exile for the past 8 months. She lay there in the dark, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, like she was not alone. Not because anyone had arrived, but because she had. The next morning she put on the red. Not for anyone, not toward anything, not as a statement directed outward, but as a declaration directed entirely inward, private and profound, and blazing like something newly ignited in the exact center of her own chest. She stood in front of the mirror and she looked at herself in red, and something that had been folded up inside her for 8 months, slowly, carefully, with tremendous dignity, began to unfold. She made coffee exactly the way she liked it, strong enough to be startling, sweet enough to be comforting, without calculating anyone else's preference. She stood in the kitchen and she drank it, and the morning light came through the window and fell across her hands and her red sweater and the steam rising from the cup. And it was not cinematic, not dramatic, not the kind of beautiful that photographs well. It was better than that. It was real. She called her mother on a Thursday. Her mother answered on the second ring. Of course she did. Mothers always answer. And when she heard her daughter's voice, something shifted in the quality of her listening. Because the voice sounded slightly different. Not entirely recovered, not fully restored, not performing the miraculous overnight transformation that only happens in stories. But present, but real, but beginning to remember itself. They talked for 2 hours about nothing and everything, and the particular way autumn was arriving that year, with unusual gentleness. The leaves changing in colors so vivid they seemed like they were trying to teach something about the beauty of transformation. When she hung up, she was crying. But the crying felt like rain after a long drought. Not destructive, not desperate, but necessary and clean and desperately, gorgeously welcome. She began writing again. Not in proper notebooks with their intimidating blankness, not in anything that felt too formal for the tentative, fragile, extraordinary process of remembering what she wanted to say. She bought a pack of small notepads, the cheap kind, spiral-bound, with slightly crooked lines, and she put one in every bag she owned, and one in the kitchen drawer, and one beside the bed. The first thing she wrote was not a poem. It was a list. Things I remember about myself, she wrote at the top. And then she sat for a long time looking at the blank lines beneath it, because remembering turned out to be harder than she'd anticipated, the losses having been so quiet, so gradual, so tenderly self-imposed, that the inventory of what was gone required real excavation, real patience, the kind of careful archaeological work you do when you're trying to recover something delicate without causing further damage in the process. She wrote, I like dancing in kitchens. She wrote, I cry at commercials with dogs and elderly people, and I will not be embarrassed about this. She wrote, red is my color. Red has always been my color. Red is the color of everything I am when I'm not editing myself into something easier to hold. She kept the list going for 3 pages. She began dancing in the kitchen again. Not immediately. Not with the full thunder of the woman she'd been before. Because recovery doesn't arrive at full volume. It arrives in increments, in quiet crescendos, in the gradual return of things you'd thought the silence had permanently swallowed. She started with small movements. A slight sway while waiting for water to boil. A single, private, tentative spin when something particularly good came on the radio. But it was dancing. It counted. Some mornings she still woke with the weight of all those nights pressed into her chest, all those months of shrinking, all those pieces given away, all those versions of herself quietly, willingly surrendered in the beautiful, misguided, very human belief that love required her diminishment. She lay in those mornings and felt the full inventory of what the losing had cost her. And she allowed herself to feel it without rushing past it, without performing composure for an audience that wasn't even there. She grieved the dancing woman honestly. She grieved the grocery receipt poet, and the woman who laughed too loud, and the woman who wore red on ordinary Mondays without thinking twice about it. She grieved them the way you grieve anything truly precious, with full attention, without apology, with the understanding that grief is simply love with nowhere left to go, searching for its subject in the rooms where the subject used to be. And then she got up, put on something red, made coffee the way she liked it, opened the window. The journey back to herself was not romantic in the way that romance is usually packaged and presented. It had no perfect lighting, no orchestral swell at the crucial moment, no single decisive turning point where everything shifted permanently and gloriously and finally into place. It was quieter than that, and more real, and more beautiful than any love story she'd ever been told, because this one had a protagonist she actually recognized, whose happiness she was actually invested in, whose survival she was actually, finally, completely committed to ensuring. She was the woman who danced in kitchens. She was the woman who cried at dogs in commercials. She was the woman who wrote poetry on grocery receipts and called her mother for 2 hours about nothing, and wore red simply because red made the air around her feel like it was worth inhabiting. She was the woman who, every night for almost a year, had lost another piece of herself, and who was now, piece by recovered piece, every morning, every Tuesday perfume, every kitchen dance, every red-wearing ordinary day, coming back. Coming back. Completely. This story is not simply about loss. It is about the particular kind of loss that disguises itself as love, the slow, voluntary, tenderly performed erosion of a woman who believes, with her entire magnificent heart, that shrinking herself is the most romantic thing she can offer. The truth this story asks us to carry is more important and more shocking than any dramatic revelation. The most devastating heartbreaks do not always come from cruelty. They come from devotion misdirected, from love that was so enormous it consumed the very person doing the loving. But the story does not end in loss. It ends in the most profoundly romantic act imaginable: a woman choosing herself. Not angrily, not dramatically, not as an act of revenge or rejection, but quietly, stubbornly, gloriously. One red sweater, one kitchen dance, one Tuesday perfume at a time. She comes back. Piece by recovered piece, morning by patient morning, she gathers herself from every corner she'd retreated into, and she returns to the fullness of who she was always meant to be. This is the love story worth telling. This is the romance worth writing. Not the one where someone saves her, but the one where she remembers that she was never lost. She was simply waiting, with extraordinary patience, for herself to come looking.